Glass shattered in the dead of night. Charles Whitfield, 62. A black security guard no one noticed, froze. He wasn't supposed to be part of the story. He was invisible, overlooked, the man everyone called the guard. But tonight he was the only thing standing between Sterling Global and a disaster worth billions. No suit, no power, just him, the echo of breaking glass, and a system that had spent decades ignoring his worth. And what happened next would prove that the people we dismiss the most often hold the keys to saving everything. Before we dive in, take a moment and comment below. Have you ever been underestimated or overlooked, and how did you respond? Your story matters, and we want to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Because stories like Charles Whitfield's remind us that heroes often come from the places society refuses to notice. Charles Whitfield, 62 years old, a security guard who had spent decades working night shifts in buildings just like this one. He didn't wear a suit, he didn't earn six figures, he wasn't invited to strategy meetings or corporate galas. To the people inside Sterling Global, he was just the guard. But when danger came knocking, literally, Charles would be the only one standing between a billion-dollar deal and total disaster. And in doing so, he would expose not only a security breach, but also the deep-rooted racism and blindness that plagued the very company he protected. Charles was no stranger to being underestimated. Born in Montgomery, Alabama in the early 1960s, he grew up in the shadow of segregation. His parents were janitors, civil rights marchers, and survivors of an America that told them their blackness was a liability, not a gift. From childhood, Charles learned two things. 1. The world would not give him anything freely. 2. His dignity must be guarded like a treasure. College never felt like an option. Money was tight, opportunities tighter. So Charles enlisted in the Army, serving with distinction, traveling across the world, proving himself again and again. But when he came home, he faced a bitter truth. A black veteran wasn't honored the same way a white one was. Job applications vanished into the void. Interviews turned into polite rejections once they saw his face. Eventually, he took steady work in security, guarding the very buildings he was never allowed to enter as an equal. For 40 years, he worked nights, patrolling empty corridors, watching monitors, logging incidents that no one read. He endured the condescension of white executives who walked past him as if he were furniture. He endured the racism of younger employees who tested his authority, questioning why a guard would dare tell them the rules. Through it all, Charles never broke. He carried himself with quiet pride, a deep baritone voice, and an unshakable belief. I may not have power in this world, but I have responsibility, and responsibility is its own kind of power. Sterling Global wasn't just another corporation. It was an empire, a tech conglomerate worth billions, with influence stretching from Silicon Valley to Wall Street. Their headquarters in Atlanta was a monument to modern wealth. Marble floors, glass elevators, digital screens glowing with stock prices and slogans about innovation. But for all its wealth, Sterling Global was also a symbol of exclusion. Out of thousands of employees, less than 5% were black. Leadership was nearly all white men. Diversity reports were written, PR campaigns were launched, but behind closed doors, racism simmered, disguised as culture fit, standards, and professionalism. Charles had seen it firsthand. He watched black interns come and go, never promoted. He overheard executives laughing about urban applicants they rejected. He watched a black secretary get fired for being unprofessional, while her white counterpart was praised for the same behavior. Charles knew the truth. Sterling Global loved to polish its image, but it did not love its black workers. And yet he showed up every night because a paycheck was a paycheck, because dignity was in the doing, because survival required it. That night, Charles began his shift like every other. He clocked in at 10 p.m. sharp, nodding to the younger guards who scrolled on their phones instead of patrolling. He adjusted his uniform, straightened his cap, and took his post. The building was quiet. Too quiet. Around midnight, as the city outside buzzed with sirens and laughter from late-night bars, Charles walked his rounds. The 27th floor smelled faintly of coffee. The 30th floor hummed with the low static of idle computers. The executive suites on the 35th floor gleamed, untouched, waiting for their masters to return in the morning. Then, he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Glass. A faint crack. Somewhere near the executive offices. Charles froze. His instincts, honed from years in the army and decades on the job, kicked in. He moved quickly but quietly, hand near the flashlight on his belt. He turned a corner and saw it. A window partially forced open, a rope dangling from the outside. Someone was breaking in. Not a random thief. No one scales 35 floors without reason. Whoever this was, they knew what they were after. Charles's pulse quickened. He radioed dispatch, but the younger guards were slow, dismissive. "Probably nothing, old man. Chill out." He gritted his teeth. Racism came in many forms, and ageism was its cousin. But Charles knew better. He wasn't about to chill out when a billion-dollar company was seconds away from being compromised. He stayed, he waited, and in the glow of the emergency lights, a figure began to climb inside. And with that, Charles Whitfield, the black security guard they all ignored, was about to change the course of Sterling Global's future. Charles steadied his breathing, his back pressed against the polished wall of the executive corridor. The faint scrape of shoes against glass grew louder. A figure slid inside, a lean man dressed head to toe in black, face obscured by a mask. The intruder landed silently on the carpet, eyes darting. He moved with precision, not hesitation. This wasn't a junkie looking for cash. This was someone who knew exactly where to go. Charles didn't reveal himself immediately. He watched. The man crept down the hall, straight toward the office of Sterling Global's CEO, Richard Sterling himself. "Lord have mercy," Charles muttered under his breath. He knew that office. It wasn't just an office. It was where billion-dollar contracts were stored, where sensitive data lived, where deals were signed that affected markets around the globe. Whatever this man wanted, it wasn't small. Charles reached for his radio again. Static. No response. The younger guards were either asleep, distracted, or ignoring him. For years, they dismissed him as the old guy who takes the job too seriously. Now their carelessness left him alone. The intruder reached into a pouch, producing tools, sleek, professional. He set to work on the CEO's private filing cabinet. That was enough. Charles stepped forward, his flashlight beam slicing through the dark. "Stop right there." The man froze, then slowly turned. The mask obscured most of his face, but his eyes narrowed at the sight of an older black guard standing firm, hand on his holster. Not for a gun, he wasn't armed, but for the heavy-duty baton he carried. "You don't want to do this," Charles said, voice steady, deep. "Put your tools down." The man smirked under the mask. "You're not stopping me, old man. Walk away." Charles didn't move. "Not tonight." The intruder lunged. A flash of metal glinted in his hand. A knife. Charles dodged back, heart pounding, instincts from his army years sparking alive. He blocked the strike with his baton, the clang echoing in the empty corridor. Pain shot up his arm, but he held firm. They struggled, crashing against the expensive furniture, scattering papers across the floor. Charles's knees ached, his muscles strained, but he fought with a ferocity that came from more than training. It came from years of being overlooked, years of being dismissed as weak, invisible, irrelevant. "Not tonight," he growled again, pushing the intruder back with a shove that sent him sprawling against the CEO's desk. The man scrambled, cursed, and bolted, diving back toward the window, rope swaying in the night air. Charles rushed forward, but the intruder was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the city. Silence returned, broken only by Charles' ragged breathing. Minutes later, the younger guards finally arrived, faces pale as Charles explained what had happened. They doubted him at first. A break-in on the 35th floor? A masked intruder scaling the tower? It sounded impossible. But the broken window told the truth. The scattered documents on the CEO's desk told the truth. The bloody smear on Charles's baton told the truth. The police were called. Reports were filed. Executives were notified. And by morning, Sterling Global was in uproar. When Richard Sterling, the CEO, swept into his office at dawn, his face was thunderous. He demanded answers. He demanded to know how his multi-million-dollar security system failed. And then, reluctantly, one of the younger guards said it. Whitfield stopped him, sir. Sterling's eyes flicked to Charles, standing near the corner, shoulders stiff, uniform rumpled from the fight. You? The CEO asked, disbelief thick in his voice. Yes, sir, Charles said simply. The room went silent. Executives glanced at each other. Some smirked, some sneered. The unspoken thought hung in the air. How could an old black guard have done what the entire system failed to do? Sterling's jaw clenched. My office, now. Inside the office, Sterling closed the door and faced Charles. Explain, he demanded. Charles recounted everything. The sound of glass breaking, the intruder's precision, the fight, the escape. He kept his tone calm, factual. He'd been in too many situations where raising his voice as a black man only made him threatening. Sterling listened, pacing. His tailored suit gleamed in the early light, his gold watch catching the sun. He looked every bit the billionaire who had never known what it meant to be ignored. Finally, he stopped. Do you know what was in that cabinet? Charles shook his head. Documents for our merger with Solvex Technologies, Sterling said grimly. A deal worth $4 billion. If those papers had been stolen, the fallout would have destroyed this company's reputation. Charles nodded slowly. Then it's good I was here. Sterling's gaze hardened. But you weren't supposed to be there. Your patrol log shows you should have been on the 20th floor at that time. Why were you upstairs? There it was. The suspicion, the accusation, the default assumption that a black man must be doing something wrong. Charles's jaw tightened. Because I heard something out of place. Glass, rope, movement. I trusted my instincts. Sterling narrowed his eyes. Or you knew something was going to happen. Charles's chest burned. He had saved the company, risked his life, and here he was, treated like a suspect. Sir, he said carefully, fighting to keep his voice even. I don't know what world you live in, but in mine a black man doesn't get the luxury of being careless. I heard trouble, so I acted, that's all. Sterling didn't respond immediately. He studied Charles, this older black guard who had just saved him from catastrophe, yet stood there being questioned like a criminal. Finally, Sterling said, Leave me. I'll decide what to do about this. Charles turned, shoulders heavy, and walked out. He had faced enemies abroad, racism at home, decades of night shifts. But somehow this moment cut deepest. Because sometimes the hardest fight wasn't against criminals. It was against disbelief, against racism itself. The day after the break-in, Sterling Global buzzed like a hive struck with a stick. Executives stormed in and out of conference rooms. Security teams pored over camera feeds. Lawyers whispered in corners. Charles, meanwhile, returned that night to his usual shift. Same uniform, same badge, same quiet nod from the receptionist who didn't look him in the eye. But the atmosphere was different. Wherever he walked, whispers followed. That's him, the guard who stopped it. Really? Thought he just sat at the desk. Lucky old man. Could have been inside job. Charles heard it all. The suspicion, the disbelief, the racism, veiled as doubt. To them, it was easier to imagine a black man guilty of collusion than capable of bravery. He ignored the murmurs, as he had done for decades. But the unease gnawed at him. Something about the intruder's precision bothered him. This wasn't random. Whoever had sent that man knew exactly where to go. And Charles couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over. 2 nights later, while doing rounds, Charles noticed something odd. The CEO's office door, normally locked tight, stood ajar. He pushed it open, careful. Inside, the room was immaculate, except for the filing cabinet, the same one the intruder had targeted. The lock had been repaired, but now it hung slightly crooked. Charles checked the drawers. At first glance, they looked full, Contracts, binders, neatly stacked folders. But on closer inspection, he noticed it. One file missing. A gap where there shouldn't be one. Charles's stomach dropped. He didn't know what was in that folder, but he knew it wasn't trivial. He closed the drawer and stepped back just as a voice cut through the silence. "What are you doing in here?" Charles turned. It was Eric Dawson, Sterling Global's head of security, a younger white man in his 40s, broad-shouldered, with the smug confidence of someone who thought his uniform gave him authority. Charles straightened. Door was open. Cabinet looked tampered with again. Eric smirked. "Or maybe you were tampering." Charles met his gaze, unflinching. "I don't break locks, son. I keep them safe." Eric stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You've been here too long, old man. People are asking questions. How do we know you didn't stage the whole thing?" The words hit like a slap, though they didn't surprise Charles. He'd lived long enough to know how quickly black men were turned from heroes into suspects. He kept his tone calm. "Believe what you want, but you'll regret ignoring me when this comes back around." "This," Eric scoffed, brushing past him. "Stay out of places you don't belong." Charles watched him go, suspicion churning. Eric had been head of security for 5 years. Under his watch, last week's intruder had waltzed up 35 floors without tripping a single alarm. And now, after Charles saved the day, Eric was the one most eager to cast blame. It didn't add up. Later that night, Charles sat in the monitoring room, reviewing camera feeds. Most showed nothing but empty hallways and silent elevators. But then, a flicker. Movement on the 33rd floor. Charles zoomed in. Eric Dawson, pacing in a conference room, phone pressed to his ear. His voice carried faintly through the feed's audio pickup. "He nearly ruined everything. No, I handled it. The old guard won't be a problem. Trust me, the files are in place. By the time Sterling knows, it'll be too late." Charles froze. His instincts were right. Eric wasn't just incompetent. He was involved. The break-in wasn't random. It was an inside job. Charles leaned closer to the screen, heart pounding. This wasn't just about theft. It was sabotage, maybe even corporate espionage. Billions on the line. But deeper than that, it was about survival. If Eric was framing him, then Charles wasn't just fighting for a company. He was fighting for his own name, his own dignity, his own right to exist without being scapegoated. He hit record on the feed, saving the snippet. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was uncovering. The next morning, Charles requested a meeting with Richard Sterling. He didn't expect it to be granted, but to his surprise, the CEO agreed. Inside the corner office, sunlight poured over glass walls and mahogany desks. Sterling sat, immaculate as ever, fingers steepled. "What is it?" he asked curtly. Charles placed a flash drive on the desk. "Evidence," he said. Sterling frowned. "Evidence of what?" Charles looked him dead in the eye. "That your head of security is working against you." Sterling laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Dawson? Ridiculous. He's been with me for years." Charles's jaw tightened. "And in those years, how many black guards have you promoted? How many voices like mine have you listened to? You trust him because he looks like you, talks like you, fits in your world. But I'm telling you, he's dirty." Sterling's smile faded. Charles slid the flash drive closer. "Listen for yourself. Then decide who you believe, the man in your suit or the man you've overlooked for 9 years." The room went quiet. Sterling stared at the small device, the weight of Charles's words hanging between them. For the first time, the CEO didn't see just a guard in a faded uniform. He saw a man who had risked everything, not only to stop a break-in, but to speak truth in the face of power. And he realized the choice before him wasn't just about saving a deal. It was about finally confronting the racism that blinded him. Richard Sterling sat alone in his office, the flash drive Charles had given him plugged into his laptop. He hesitated before clicking play, almost hoping it would prove Charles wrong. But the voice was unmistakable. Eric Dawson. "He nearly ruined everything." "No, I handled it. The old guard won't be a problem." Sterling froze. His head of security, the man he trusted to protect his billion-dollar empire, was plotting behind his back. When the recording ended, Sterling leaned back, eyes wide, his jaw clenched. Not just at the betrayal, but at the realization that Charles had been right. For 9 years he had overlooked the man, dismissed him as a relic. And yet Charles was the one who had saved him, twice now. But admitting that meant admitting something else. That his company wasn't just vulnerable to theft, it was infected with prejudice. Word spreads fast in skyscrapers. By the next day, Eric Dawson had already caught wind that Charles had gone to the CEO. That night, when Charles arrived for his shift, Eric was waiting at the security desk, arms folded, smirk plastered across his face. "You really think you're clever, old man?" Eric said. "Running to Sterling with your little tape?" Charles stared at him, unshaken. "I don't think. I know." Eric leaned closer, his voice a venomous whisper. "You think he'll believe you over me? You've been sitting in that chair for 9 years, invisible. Nobody in this company even remembers your name. When this blows up, guess who's going down first? Not me." Charles didn't flinch. "I've been underestimated my whole life. Doesn't bother me anymore. What bothers me is liars who think they're untouchable." Eric chuckled darkly. "Enjoy your last shift. It'll be your shortest." And with that, he walked away. Charles knew then that Dawson wasn't going to sit back and wait. He was going to strike, and soon. 2 nights later, alarms blared through the building at 2 a.m. Charles sprinted up the stairwell, his knees aching, but his instincts sharp. On the 35th floor, smoke filled the hall. A small fire blazed in a wastebasket, right outside the CEO's office. Sprinklers hissed, security lights flashed. But what chilled Charles most wasn't the fire. It was what he found inside the office. The filing cabinet stood open again, and inside, planted in plain sight, was his own ID badge. Charles's stomach dropped. It was the perfect setup. The cameras would show him entering the office. The badge was proof. And Eric would make sure everyone believed it. Within minutes, other guards stormed in, led by Eric himself. "There he is," Eric shouted, pointing at Charles. "Caught in the act." The others grabbed Charles by the arms. He didn't resist. His eyes locked on Eric's, reading the smug triumph in them. Charles spoke evenly, his voice calm despite the chaos. "You planted it," Eric smirked. "Tell it to the boss." The next morning, Charles stood in a glass-walled conference room before Richard Sterling and half the executive board. His badge lay on the table like Exhibit A. Eric painted his story with precision. He staged the first break-in to look like a hero. Then last night he tried again. This time we caught him red-handed. Murmurs filled the room. Some executives nodded, already convinced. Sterling raised a hand. "And what about the recording?" Eric didn't miss a beat. "Doctored, easy to fake these days. Think about it, who benefits from this? Not me. Him. He's desperate for recognition, for a payout before retirement. It's obvious." All eyes turned to Charles. For a moment, the weight of decades pressed down on him. The long history of being doubted, dismissed, discarded. But this time, he refused to be silent. He stepped forward, his voice steady, deep. "You can believe him, or you can believe the man who's guarded this building for 9 years without losing so much as a paperclip. I've endured your silence, your blind eyes, your dismissals. I've endured men like him, climbing ladders built on lies. But last week, when danger came to your door, it wasn't him who stopped it. It was me. Because this company may not see me, but I see it. I see everything." The room went still. Sterling's eyes searched Charles's, weighing truth against convenience. And in that silence, Eric's mask slipped. Just for a second, his jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed. Too defensive, too desperate. Sterling caught it. He leaned back slowly. "Mr. Dawson," he said, "I think it's time we take a closer look at your record." Eric's smirk faltered. Charles stood tall, knowing the fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he wasn't just a guard in the shadows. He was a man, finally being seen. Charles returned that night for what might have been his final shift. Rumors swirled through the building. Some still believed Eric's story. Others whispered that the CEO was beginning to doubt his head of security. Charles didn't care about gossip anymore. He cared about the truth. He knew men like Eric. When cornered, they didn't fold. They struck harder, and that meant danger. So instead of sitting at his usual desk, Charles walked the halls like a soldier on patrol, eyes sharp, ears tuned. He'd spent 9 years guarding this place. He knew every echo, every shadow. And tonight, something felt wrong. Near midnight, Charles entered the sub-basement, an area few guards ever patrolled. The hum of generators filled the air. Then, a sound behind him. "Looking for me?" Eric's voice echoed in the dim light. Charles turned slowly. Eric stood there, a gun in his hand, his face twisted with fury. "You should have stayed invisible, old man," Eric snarled. "Nobody would have cared. Nobody would have noticed. But you just had to play hero." Charles stayed calm, though his heart thudded. Heroes don't plant evidence. Heroes don't sell out their own company. Eric stepped closer, the gun steady. "You think Sterling's gonna save you? He'll cut you loose the second this gets messy. That's how it works. People like you, always disposable." Charles met his eyes. "If that were true, you wouldn't be down here with a gun. You'd already be in his office, explaining yourself. But you're not, because deep down, you know I've already won." For the first time, Eric's hand trembled. Rage burned in his face. And then, from the shadows, a click. Lights flickered on. Behind Eric, Richard Sterling stepped forward, flanked by 2 board members and a police officer. In his hand, a small recorder blinked red. "Enough, Dawson," Sterling said coldly. "We heard everything." Eric froze, his eyes wide. "What? No, he set me up." But the officer was already stepping forward, weapon drawn. "Drop it." Eric's face crumbled. For a moment, he looked at Charles with raw hatred. Then he dropped the gun, clattering to the floor. As the officer cuffed him, Charles exhaled slowly. Not from relief, but from the weight of years of silence breaking at last. Later in Sterling's office, Charles stood while the CEO poured 2 glasses of water. For once, Sterling didn't sit behind his desk. He handed Charles a glass like an equal. "I owe you more than I can ever say," Sterling admitted. His voice was quieter, humbled. "You didn't just save this company. You exposed what I refused to see. About Dawson. About myself." Charles sipped his water, saying nothing. Sterling went on. "For 9 years, you've been invisible to me. I looked right past you, and yet you were the only one who truly protected us. That's shameful." Finally, Charles spoke, his tone firm but not bitter. "Seeing me now doesn't erase those 9 years. But it's a start." Sterling nodded, swallowing hard. "It won't be words only. I want you leading a new security division. Full authority. Your judgment, your leadership. Name your salary." Charles paused, thinking. For so long, recognition hadn't mattered. But now it wasn't about him. It was about the next guard who came after, the young men who deserved to be seen from the start. "I'll take it," he said, "but only if we start doing more than just protecting this building. You've got blind spots, Mr. Sterling. It's time we fix them." For the first time, Sterling extended his hand, not as a boss to an employee, but as one man to another. Charles shook it, his grip strong. The news broke within days. Head of security arrested for espionage. Guard saves Sterling Global. Charles's name spread across headlines, but more importantly, it spread through the company. The man who had once been a shadow was now a symbol of vigilance, of courage, of dignity long denied, but finally acknowledged. And as Charles walked his rounds the next week, new guards saluted him with respect in their eyes. Not because he had stopped a break-in, but because he had forced the world to see him. Charles Whitfield's story isn't just about a guard saving a company. It's about all the Black lives that work tirelessly, quietly, and are too often ignored. It's a reminder. Never underestimate someone because of their role, their skin, or the quiet way they move through the world. Courage, dignity, and insight are often found in the most unexpected places. Let this story inspire you to see the unseen, hear the unheard, and value every life, because heroes are not always in suits, titles, or corner offices.